Hello, and welcome to EGR362, Engineering Physiology, where we start to talk about tissues, skin, and bone. So let's get started. A tissue is a group of cells similar in function and in location. Oops. Location. There we go. And when you have a group of cells with a similar function and location, they produce a similar structure. Therefore, similar structure. Now, there are all kinds of tissues. The first is called epithelial, which is a kind of sheet. Epithelial is another word for skin. The most common example of an epithelial tissue is skin. Also, blood vessels. Those are called endothelium. But getting back to epithelial tissues, they are sheets of contiguous cells. Sheets of continuous cells attached to a basal lamina. Now, a basal lamina is an anchor point located in the deepest part of the skin. But we'll get more familiar with basal lamina and all of the sheets in the forthcoming lecture. So, the next tissue is connective. Now, there are many, many, many kinds of connective tissues. Ranging from, from secretion cells in the endocrine system to smooth muscle, adipose, collagen, etc. However, the connective tissue themselves secrete proteins into the ECM, which we understood last time as the extracellular environment or cellular matrix. Now, muscle gets a tissue type all of its own. Previous slide said connective tissues would include smooth muscle. That is incorrect. Muscle is its own separate type. I was thinking of how muscles contract, where they release calcium and after contraction, because calcium rushes into the cell when it contracts, but I am mistaken. Muscle has its own tissue. There is skeletal, which are like flexing biceps, or quadriceps, etc. Then there are smooth, which is commonly found around lungs, not the lung tissue, the areoli. That's what constricts when asthmatic people have an asthma attack. And the third is cardiac. Cardiac muscle is its own separate type of muscle because it's continuously beating. Otherwise, someone could die, obviously. But there is a very specific nervous system set up so that the heart continues to pump and beat. And we will get there, later in the class. And then the fourth kind of tissue that you find in the body is nervous. Nervous tissue. The most fundamental unit of the nervous tissue is the neuron. And the second are called glia, G-L-I-A, or the singular glial with an L, G-L-I-A-L. Okay. So as we think about tissues, we think about their basal components. We already talked about the cell and how that is the most fundamental unit of life. But now we're going up the chain as cells grow and become differentiated. So cells give rise to tissues, and then tissues give rise to organs. And then organs, once all conglomerated in some sort of figure and shape, they work together to eventually form you and I in an organism. And that's what the class is all about, life science. Very, very interesting. I'm going to cut that out. So, give rise to you and I in organisms. Now, going back to the most fundamental of tissues, the epithelia, the characteristics of epithelia, or epithelial tissue, are the following. And I'm going to change colors. The first is a bad marker. Stick to blue. The first are sheets of continuous cells. Now, this doesn't mean that they're all one cell, but rather they're stacked up like Legos. Very tight together. And we'll discuss how they're connected in a little bit. So the first characteristic, sheets of continuous cells, and the second is that they're attached to the basal lamina. Attached to the basal lamina. And that allows it to be separated from the underlying tissues, which separates from underlying tissues. Thirdly, is that it's polarized. Now, it's not magnetically polarized, so I'll put it in air quotes. Rather that there's a top and a bottom, which relates to the fact that they're on top of a basal lamina. The fourth major characteristic is that junctions link these particular cells. In addition to the basal lamina. And finally, these cells replicate. You think about how much your skin is in contact with the environment. You get a scratch, take a shower, scratch your arm. That means the layers of cells are actually falling off and coming off of their original place. So they need to replicate. They need to constantly rebuild, repair, and make sure there are no breaks. All right. Next, we'll talk about these features more in depth. So if I were to draw what an epithelial set of cells would look like, they would look like this, like little jelly blocks, stacked right up on top of each other. Now, the cells are continuous. And they are attached to a basal lamina, which I will draw here in red, like little anchor points. That means they will be distinct from other cells lying below it, and the basal lamina will serve as a layer of extracellular protein. You can think about it as an anchor. So I'll put anchor in parentheses, proteins. Now the nomenclature here is what are called simple and stratified. Simple is what you would expect. Single or very few layers. Stratified would mean that they are stacked. Stacked multiple on each other. Now, if I were to, I'll just write stacked here. Now, you might ask yourself, what is the epithelial cells separating from? Well, generally, they separate environments. And these different environments we call lumen. Think of lumen like a cavity or an enclosure that the skin separates those cavities from. For instance, the skin separates us from the air and the various matter that you find in the air. Another example of epithelial separation would be in the stomach, where the stomach lumen will be high in acid, and the underlying tissues would not be happy if they were in such an acidic environment. So they separate them. And those areas within the lumen, I'll do that in green, are called apical. A-P-I-C-A-L. And that simply just stands for the face of the cell that interacts with the lumen. Versus the basal, which interacts with the underlying tissues, whether that be connective, muscle, nervous, etc. Okay. Move on to the next page. Now, I told you that these cells replicate, and they replicate by cell division. Now, what are the main cell division types? Very good, mitosis and meiosis. But in this case, skin is not a sex cell. Therefore, mitosis is the only method of replication. Mitosis only. Now, when mitosis goes through the roof, that's called carcinoma, which is when a cell or group of cells would just skyrocket out of control. And how would I put that? Run away replication. And these are common with too much sunburn, or the ABCs of moles. Let's see if I can remember that right. Let's see. Will you see me if I go? Okay. So if they relate to moles, A is asymmetry. So if they're like a wonky shape, B, I don't remember. C was color. So brown is okay. Other, should probably check it out. D is, oh no, B, I'm sorry, B was border. There we go. So if it's a hard border versus a soft, out of focus. One of my doctor friends taught me these, and so that's just helped me think about like how epithelial cells can either go out of control or not work properly. So that's a little bit of medical terminology for you, or diagnostic medical terminology. So now let's move on to how the cells are anchored together. So you might think, so considering when the cells are stacked on top of each other, there are anchor points at each position among the cell. And my light's turned off. Hello. There we go. And my other light's turned off. There we go. Sorry about that. I'm not really moving around much, so the building thinks that no one's in here. But I am in here. Here I am. Hello. Okay, back to anchoring junctions. Anchoring junctions. So there are two types. One is called hemidesmosome. Hemidesmosome. And those attach cells to the basal lamina. And let me underline that in red so we keep our colors straight. There we go. So that would be these junctions right here. And I will color the bottom half in with red. There we go. And the second type just gets rid of the hemi and just goes with, oops, I misspelled it. Desmosome, which attaches neighboring cells to each other. There we go. Attaches neighboring cells. So I will mark that here in green with big fat lines. And they go vertically as well as horizontally. Now, if I were to zoom in on a cell like this, here's what that would look like. I would have an anchor point inside one cell on both sides, and it would be the same with another cell. So the two halves of the anchor match together and really link those cells together. And of course, you have your basal lamina on the bottom. Now within these desmosomes comes a new kind of junction called tight junctions. So if I draw another set of cells, I'll just do 3 here. I do not have another color. So I will just use blue for these junctions. The next junctions are called tight, which, as its name implies, are waterproof and doesn't let anything get in between the cells. So actually I'm going to draw them as little squigglies or curlies. There we go. And those provide blockage. Blockage between the cells. And it really separates the lumens from one another. Before we talked about plasma membranes and how they're semi-permeable. Tight junctions are zero permeable. So you would call that non-permeable. There you go. And they're also called occluding junctions. But their more common name is tight. And that makes more sense more intuitively. So let's see, what else do I have to say? Okay, moving on to a different kind of junction. So what if I wanted something to pass through one of these cells? Then I would need some kind of channel or an opening. And that's exactly what you get. So these are called gap junctions. A gap junction is an intercellular opening. An intercellular opening. So that means ions, water, and other molecules can pass through the gap. Just like in Britain, mind the gap. You watch it so your leg doesn't fall through. Perfect analogy. So if I had a gap junction, it would look something like this between two cells. And so you have the spaces, so I'll call this lumen 1 in blue, and then lumen 2 down here. Now say one cell needs something from the other one. Well, then there are little linkage proteins within the space between the two cells. So that means if I have an excess of calcium, calcium 2+, that can go over to the next cell. No problem. Now, the way that the gap is open and closed is exactly the mechanism that I just elaborated on. calcium goes from one side to the other. So gap junctions are mediated by calcium. And instead of spelling out calcium, I will just say Ca2+. In addition to calcium, these gap junctions are mediated by low pH also. So low pH would mean an excess or a high concentration of hydrogen ions. Now, calcium goes over from one side to the other. Some kind of molecule is passed between the first and second lumen. Then the pH would drop. I have H+ here, comes over and clamps down on the gap. And that's how the gap junctions work. Going back to these interlinking proteins, let me just name them. They are called connexin, which are transmembrane proteins that link cells in their extracellular matrix. Perfect. And moving on. Oh, I need this. Okay, so that's a gap junction that's mediated by calcium and low pH. But let's think about if something needs to get out. For instance, sweat glands. Let's call them exocrine glands. Exocrine glands. Now we can tell from the naming that exo means external. So something is traveling from the interior to the exterior, which is what happens when you sweat. They are modified and epithelial cells. Or they're also called duct glands. And they look like this. So you're chopping up cells. They're stacked up on top of each other. Let's not go that big. That and up like so. Now these are all cells that are stacked up on top of each other. Now, the top layer is called surface epithelium. And they are all attached to a basal lamina. Again, well, I mark them here in red. There we go. And what does sweat glands produce? Well, sweat, obviously. That means water. And salt, which would be sodium and calcium. Not calcium, chlorine. Excuse me. Now the actual duct epithelial cells are these right here on the sides. So you have the duct gland and then the duct cells, epithelial cells lining the gland. Now the bottom has right here the secretory area. Ooh, nice green. Secretory cells, or secretionary cells. Another example of the secretory cells would be salivary glands. Salivary. Sweat, obviously. And mammary. A common characteristic of all mammals. Let's see. So the secretory cells can produce many products. Saliva, which contains digestive enzymes, sweat, and milk. And they come from the bottom up and are released through the top at the surface. Okay. Moving on to the next page. So that about does it for the skin. I'm going to take this opportunity to talk a little bit more about connective tissues, and then we'll call it a day. I just want to get a pretty broad overview of connective tissues. A, because there are just a lot of them, and B, they compose a lot of the body. And then we'll be able to speak more intelligently about the different body organs. There we go. Connective tissues. Connective tissues really follow the bottom-up approach. So cells, tissues, to organs. Like I said, skin is a common one, but also hair, and the system that makes up your hair is another one. And this is also where collagen comes in. Collagen, ligaments, tendons, etc. So they originate from a cell type called mesenchymal. And I'll spell that out for you. From mesenchymal. MESOCHYMICAL. From mesenchymal cells, or commonly called stem cells. The study of originating cells, or where cells originate from rather, is called developmental. So if you want to talk more about stem cells, take a developmental biology class. Very interesting field of study, especially in recent years. Now, the mesenchymal cells originate several cell types. The first one are called fibrocytes. Now, as the name implies, they contain a lot of fibers. And this would be called proper connective tissue. So I'll just write the shorthand for that, CT, proper connective tissue. Whenever a biologist would say proper, that means that they are the most fundamental or classical example of a tissue type, or an instance of a classical enzyme. It's the most common or the most intuitive example of that particular biomolecule. So fibrocytes include tendons, which connect muscle to bone, and ligaments. Oops, I misspelled that. Ligaments, there we go. Which are muscle to muscle. And the final kind of fibrocytes are the dermis, or is the dermis rather, which is skin, of course. Now, skin has about, I think, actually I don't remember how many layers, but there are two main ones, but they all have different thicknesses depending on if there's calluses or not. But I'm not going to I'll go into a little bit of detail about the skin. Very interesting. Okay. The next type, which I will do in green, which are called chondrocytes. 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 Chondrocytes include cartilage. Now, there are several types of cartilage. Not all cartilages are created equal. And I have enough battery, cool. The first one is called hyaline. HYALINE. And those are very dense with what are called glucosamine, or the shorthand is glycan, or glycosamine. Which, as the name implies, is 1 part sugar and 1 part amino acid. So combined, they are very hydrophilic. Glycosamine are very saturated with water. The friction coefficient of cartilage when it's in a really, excuse me, okay, sorry about that. As I was saying, the friction of, or the coefficient of friction between two sheets of hyaline cartilage is almost 0. It's like ice on ice. And that is one reason why we as biomedical engineers haven't been able to reproduce it, because it's so saturated with water, but it's not a solid form of water. It's all liquid. So as engineers, we think about it as ice on ice. Very, very strange and fascinating type of tissue. The next kind of cartilage is elastic, which is composed of elastin, which is like very stretchy, very fibrous. One example is the ear. So I can pull my ear out way farther than I can like my leg, like my knees. So elastin composes the ears. And the last type is called fibrocartilage. Which are like the knees. The knees. And we have 2 more. First one is called osteocytes, which are bones. So those are composed of calcium phosphate. Can you see me? Yes. Calcium phosphate, which compose bone and some cartilage. And I'll go right here. And the last type, which I'll do right here, which are called hematopoietic, which is blood. So the first type is called erythrocyte. Blood. Platelets. And immune cells, which are referred to as cells of immunity. So just to recap, and then we'll call it a day. There are many kinds of connective tissues. The first are called fibrocytes, which are proper connective tissue, which include tendons, ligaments, skin. Chondrocytes, which are cartilage, which include hyaline, ice on ice, elastin, and fibrocartilage. Bones, composed of calcium phosphate and osteocytes. And then hematopoietic stem cells. Let me add that, hematopoietic stem cells, which are erythrocytes, platelets, and immune cells. So with that, we'll call it a day. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something.